Hey, all, Doug Pagitt here. My new show is called Now We're Talkin with Doug Pagitt. So here's the deal. I'm changing the name and the frame a bit of my classic podcast. Used to be called The TikTok Take. Now it's called Now We're Talkin. This is going to be my interview format show. Here's why. I'm going to be releasing a few different kinds of podcasts, and here's why. In 2018, I'm going to be launching a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week audio network, podcast radio network. It's called A More Beautiful World Audio Network. It's going to be fantastic. I'm going to talk for 24 straight hours every day. No, I'm not going to talk for 24 hours on any day. I might run for 24 hours on some day. Can't wait to do that. But I'm not going to talk for 24 hours. What we're going to do is have a number of people that have regular slots of a podcast. We're going to need 100 slots to be filled for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 68 of those hours, we're going to play some reruns. But we're going to try to put together a stream that allows you to start listening at any point during the day and hear the kinds of a more beautiful world imagination that you've come to love in my podcast and so many others. So we're going to be pulling lots of people in. They're going to have their own streams, but they're also going to be in this one. It's going to be great. So anyway, in that world and others, it's going to be a number of different versions of podcasts. A lot more on that coming. But today, in the inaugural version of Now We're Talkin with Doug Pagitt podcast is my conversation with Jeff Hood. Jeff has written a book called The Execution of God, Encountering the Death Penalty. We talk about this in the podcast. It goes for about an hour. I think it's worth every minute of it. We talk a bit about the book, but also about his life and about all of us, the faith for all of us. There's just a lot in this. It's really rich and really dense. If you don't know Jeff already, you can find him at his website, which is revjeffhood.com. So he's great. You're going to enjoy him. I think there's a lot in this. There's also a video version. I think it's worth watching the video version. So if you normally just listen to the podcast, great. Thank you. Tell all your friends about it. Keep doing that. But if you also want to see what he looks like and watch our conversation, it's over on my Facebook page, the Doug Pagitt page, and on my profile. It's also publicly listed there on my profile. So we don't even have to be friends. I mean, I don't know, maybe we are friends. But if we're not, just go look me up, go on my stream, you'll see it. It was recorded today on the 12th of September of 2017. So here it is, my conversation on, and by the way, I get the name of the book wrong. I put it up on a whole banner and everything. I was calling it Executing God, but it's called The Execution of God, Encountering the Death Penalty by the Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood. Enjoy. Hey, and thanks for listening. Tell people about the podcast and its new name, if you would. That's Dr. Jeff Hood, author of The Execution of God. You know what? I've called it Executing God every single time I've written it. Right there. Right there below your name and right there on the Facebook thing. Sorry about that. Maybe I should read all the words. Execution of God. It's okay.
Similar concepts, right?
It is. Has that happened to you? Has that happened to you as you've talked about the book, that you got your own title wrong?
You know, we very much considered that being the title.
Wow.
So
I kind of wish you had. It would have made it, more convenient for me.
Yeah, it's very connected.
I can't read the words. Hey, well, congratulations on it. I was chatting with a friend today. I was reading through and chatting with a friend and telling her about it. And she, said, "Hey, what are you doing today?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to do this great interview with a friend of mine, Jeff, and he's got this book." And I said, "It's kind of a tough subject." And she looked at it and she was like, "Oh yeah." And she kind of got that feeling that people like you and I, when we talk to people about executions, that they get, that look of like, oh, I wish that stuff didn't happen, but I just don't know how to think about it. Are you getting that reaction to people when you tell them that you've written a book called The Execution of God?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult subject. It reminds me of that classic old sermon about Friday's dreadful and Friday hurts so much, but Sunday's coming.
Sunday's coming, yeah.
And I think no matter where my faith takes me, whether that's in a more conservative fundamentalist space of my youth or the more progressive space I'm in now, people always want to rush till Sunday. And, there's nothing nothing pretty. There's nothing nice about this subject. In fact, I'll share a little story with you. One of the guys that I've worked with on death row, I'm very intentional about not engaging. I had a fly. Sorry. I'm very intentional about not looking at their crimes before I go see them, because I don't want my interaction with them tainted by what they did. And sometimes they want to tell me what they did, and sometimes they don't. Either way is fine. So when I was visiting this one gentleman, he begins to not just talk about what he did, not just talk about what he's convicted of, but to describe basically the murder of a child. And it was horrific, and it was to the point where I had to kind of set the phone down and take a second and come back. And this gentleman has many mental deficiencies. He's got a lot going on. But the reason I bring up that story is to just say that in that space, there was no resurrection. There was no, it was very, very difficult. And I guess, the question for the abolitionists, the activists against the death penalty is, are you willing to stand with this gentleman until the end? And for me, I've always believed that Jesus, that's what Jesus does. And so I want to follow in that path.
How did you get into your path of engaging with men on death row? And because there's one thing to be a death penalty abolitionist, like in theory, right? A lot of people are, but you're actually going to prisons, and I've done that too. And how did you get there? How did you get to the place where you're sitting across from someone? And
I was very influenced by my upbringing. I mean, honestly, as an evangelical Christian, we were so everybody talked about being pro-life all the time, and of course they were talking about abortion. But I began to think about that, like in my teenage years, and I began to consider, okay, if we're pro-life, what are the ramifications of that? And I began to think about poverty, and eventually stumbled upon the death penalty. And I am one of these abolitionists, I guess, of my generation and generations above me that was incredibly influenced by Helen Pagitt and Dead Man Walking and that story. And my views began to shift at that point. But it wasn't until the execution of Troy Davis that I went from this abolitionist, our anti-death penalty, to this kind of radical, going to the prisons, doing all of these, actions and direct actions to really seek abolition where I was. And, that case was so interesting. I was a student at Emory when all of this was going down. And it was so interesting because, there was this racial piece, which I think brought a lot of attention to the case. There was an innocence piece. And there was also this piece of I don't want to say being in the wrong. I mean, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, obviously.
Right.
But there was a relational piece that him and his buddies, truly were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people, I think their gateway in is the recognition of people being falsely convicted, right? And that's a whole narrative, right? If someone's falsely convicted, then we want to make sure that people who didn't commit a crime are not paying the ultimate price. And that's really powerful. I think a real problem. I think there's a significant number of people who are on death row who were not guilty of those crimes. But you're tapping into even another level of critique and of calling here, aren't you? Like, you're not just saying, hey, let's make sure we only execute the truly guilty. You're asking people to think differently about the whole process of executing or killing anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the conversation is, I guess, connected or grounded in this like guilt or innocence conversation,
Yeah.
I think we're in a lot of trouble. I mean, when I look at the execution of Jesus, I see someone who was guilty. Guilty of violating, the ethos of that society. And so when I go and visit these men, even if they are innocent of the crimes that they've been convicted of, they are still guilty when it comes to the ethos of our society. They're poor, they're mentally ill, they're a racial minority, on and on and on. And I think that connection, what that brings me to is, this Matthew 25, what you've done to the least of these connection, and begin to say, okay, well, if Jesus was guilty in the eyes of his society, and a lot of these people are guilty in the eyes of their society, what kind of connections develop, and where does that take us in terms of our faith?
And you are like, you're a demonstrator, right? I mean, you're not just an activist, but
right.
You're a performance artist in your activism. Is that a fair term?
I think we've talked about this not too long ago, but a couple of years ago, I did a 200-mile walk, and I know you're a
you should start running that thing. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do a run walk across the country for all this stuff.
That's what I was to say. I didn't run it; I walked it. But
me too, pretty much.
But nevertheless, I mean, like I was arrested last year in front of the execution chamber during the execution of Adam Ward. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that there is something incredibly valuable about being willing to place our bodies into the conversation in a very real way. And again, it makes me think, when you say performance artist, that makes me think of God. Is God's presence in Jesus like a performance? Like,
art, totally.
Is the execution a work of performance art?
Yeah.
Certainly, we see the gospel is talking about pain, but I think that the questions that our system of executions, the death penalty, the questions that they draw out of us, I think has the potential of taking our theology to a whole nother level, to a whole nother way of life, way of evolution. Salvation, truly getting saved, I guess, is a good way of saying
like that's what's interesting about the book. I don't know if you said it this directly, but that abolitionism is really a way towards salvation, right? Like you're not just trying to solve a particular problem. You're trying to call humanity to this other way of living and being.
I had a conversation yesterday with Morgan Guyton, and got a lot of love for Morgan, but he asked, where did this all change for you? And I said, I got saved, and
I love it.
And I began to talk about. I actually kind of used the road to Damascus experience and say, I saw the light, the scales, fell from my eyes, and it's interesting that. We have so many people. I thought about this with Hurricane Harvey over here. There's so many people who, are giving to the Red Cross, and they're so devastated by what they see in Houston. And the question becomes, where in the hell were y'all 6 months ago?
Right.
And anyways.
So, the reason I bring up all that performance art piece, because I think it's really important, right? Like your way of being, people that are watching the video version of this can see your look, right? You've curated a particular look, which I like, and has a sort of out of norm, a bit of the radical prophetic look to it. I had a friend that knew you were doing this interview today, and he said to me, man, I don't know who that guy is, but I saw his picture and he just looks so, and he didn't even know what to say, right? Looking at your picture on the back of your book. And then, you know, you've got this thing going, this vibe and this sense that you're playing a different tune, that it's a little wild, right? It's a little off. I think it's what you've called in your other writings, it's queer, right? Mm-hmm. And that's that way of like performing is not to, here's what I'm getting to, is what you write in the preface. It seems to me that you're not just saying like, hey, I want to be quirky just to stand out. You're trying to narrate the possibility that a Baptist preacher now in Texas, formerly, you know, in Atlanta in the South, can have these views to call us to a different kind of life that's abnormal, and we need a little more abnormality in the whole thing. I'm going to read that passage, but do you want to say something about what you're getting at in the preface and what you're doing with that?
I'll speak again to my evangelical upbringing. You know, all the rock artists, man, they get you in that space and you're raising your hands and the lights are going everywhere. And, you know, I remember many of these bands would always say, you know, you need to stand up and, you know, there'll be persecution for that. Your friends are going to laugh, but you need to stand up. I mean, it's, you know, obviously looking back on it now, I find that incredibly silly. Like, you know, people getting all kinds of mess all over the world, all kinds of persecution. And, you know, for us upper middle class folks to stand up and call that kind of crazy. But nevertheless, I do think throughout my experience, my Christian experience, there has been a consistent knowledge that you got to stand alone and you got to stand out. But the problem is I never see anybody doing it. And so,
well, they're not in a crowd. That's maybe why you don't see them. They're just that one guy, that one lady standing over there. It's that one kid. But, he just thought he was lonely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, truth be known, I'm somewhat of an introvert, and you know, that occasionally, you know, does well at being an extrovert. But you know, I
saw a picture the other day where I think you were before maybe the city council in Dallas. Were you there with Michael Waters and something else? Yeah, who's also great. And you were like, I don't know what it looked like in the picture. Like you were aggressively making your point.
Oh man, I had, you know, everybody. I can't remember if it was a minute. I think it was a minute, but I got up there and I said 3 sentences. I said, we got to quit. I said, racism is not right because God is not white. Have some courage. Don't be cowards. Let's take these damn things out tonight.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and I was furious because I feel like there's nothing worse than to view people with power who are trying to kind of jockey, you know, and figure out when that right time to utilize that power is. You know, the Mayor Rawlings, the mayor of Dallas, you know, he gave a speech a couple of months ago, maybe not that long ago, but nevertheless, he gets up there and he says, you know, I have such a conviction that these Confederate monuments need to be brought down, and not just brought down, but brought down soon. He said, but I think we need to have a task force to talk about the issue. And it's like, if your morals are mediated through a task force, if your ethics are mediated through elders and, you know, church council, of course, maybe this is the Baptist in me coming out, but
right.
I just find it, I mean, I don't need someone to tell me how to do the right thing, what I feel like God has called me to do. And so, you know, Doug, I get all the time people saying things like, Jeff, that's crazy. If you do that, it's going to hurt your message. Nobody's going to, I mean, if I like had $1 for every time I heard that's going to hurt your message,
You'd have more dollars than you have from.
Yeah, I would have a tremendous
amount of dollars. All right, so here's what I want to ask you about. Is the last section of the preface, and you write. First of all, I'm wondering if I heard reviewers or read reviewers in here saying that they thought the book was part memoir, and part like calling. It's also a poetry book, at least to my imagination. Like,
right,
the thing reads. Well, there's poetry in it, and the way you use Bible passages is this, real preacher kind of way. So I'm interested in your comments on what genre you think this book fits in. And in the preface, I want to read this for people. In case, and by the way, the book is called "The Execution of God," not the thing that's on the screen. This is not. You write, "This is not a normal book. I ain't gonna study killing no more. Normal is always about killing, from our economic systems to crime to war to a wild assortment of other manifestations. I can think of nothing more normal in our world than killing. I'm trying to get away from killing. I'm interested in getting back to life. Now, real life is always something other than normal. With the knowledge that normal always leads to more dead bodies, I set out to write something queer. I have no doubt that I did." And then you launch into the book. Do you remember writing that? Do you remember what you were?
Yeah, I do. When I wrote the book, I was all over the place. At one point, I was in Qatar writing, and at another point, I was in Dubai, and then I spent a couple of weeks in Zimbabwe. Wow. Last year. And, it's interesting to be in those types of spaces and to write about home. Obviously Texas is, it's all encompassing. I mean, normativity is all encompassing, but it's interesting because in Texas, like, everybody with a cowboy hat and boots thinks that they're the only person with a cowboy hat and boots. I mean, and so there's a normativity in this self-proclaimed uniqueness. But, so I think the book is, it's queer, obviously. I mean,
talk about that word for people that aren't as familiar with it and don't use it in the sort of multivariate.
So I would say that, a couple of years ago, I wrote a book called The Courage to be Queer. And it was my doctoral project, and it was about what does it mean or what does it look like to be different, and how has God made us? And so, for me, the queerest being of them all is God, and God is unable to be described. God does not fit within our borders and boundaries. God is not normative. God simply is, and so the I guess pathway to God for us is to simply be, and very influenced by Paul Tillich and The Courage to Be, and this whole idea of being salvific. And so with this book, I mean, I set out to kind of explore theology, but also I wanted to explore it creatively. And so that little ballad that goes all the way through the book is, I imagine, like a bluegrass band strumming that along. And I think it's also a hats off or an ode to the South. I'm very much a Southerner. I'm very much influenced by Southern culture. And, the South executes more people than any other region. And so, I also felt like that would be kind of a connection to a lot of Southern folk who maybe might not get as connected to the theology, but they're kind of interested in this strange ballad that goes all the way through. So I think there's a lot in the book. There's a lot for different people, but truly, Doug, I don't write to make a lot of money. I don't make a lot of money on my books, but I write these books with the idea that, I might have to self-publish them, Thankfully, the good folks at Chalice picked it up. But
way to go, Chalice Press.
But I guess what I'm saying is, they always used to say you need to write for your reader, and you sit in all of these like writing workshops and all that. I just don't believe that.
No, it's just a lie. Yeah, you write for yourself. I mean, you're right to try to say the thing you're trying to say, right?
Well, almost like Doug. I don't know if you feel like this, but there's a sense in which, as you write, you're working out your salvation. Also maybe even with fear and trembling. You're
and a lot of self-criticism at the same time, right?
Unfortunately. Right. I find myself, in the book as I write about like actions and how I guess connected to different people. You have to ask yourself, okay, was it good that I did that? Was it good that I connected to this person? Was I helpful to this person? And sometimes the answer is no. And I think you learn to love through that, and you learn to try again.
Yeah. For people who don't yet know your pedigree, you have a doctorate, and you've written a bunch of books, and you're an activist. How do you put your whole life together? What is that? Like, what's the fabric of the way you're doing this in the world? And the reason I'm asking is because a lot of people are trying to figure out their own equation. They've been running some version of a math problem in their life, trying to put the pieces together. They work somewhere, and then they try to have meaning somewhere else. They try to have a family. And one of the big projects for a lot of us is trying to figure out, how do you have a life that does for you any good and is of any benefit and goodness to anyone else? So that's partly why I'm asking you the question. How do you do this?
Sure. I mean, like we talked a little bit about earlier, I have 5 children, 5 young children, twins that are 5, a 3-year-old, and twins that are 2. And so my wife birthed 5 children in 3 years.
It's unbelievable.
So,
I'm just having a panic attack thinking about it. We had 4, but at least they were a year apart.
Our lives have been a little nuts. But, my children really are kind of a force for me. Oftentimes I will bring them to protests and actions, and I'll do press conferences with my daughter, holding my daughter. And, even though the littlest ones, even though they don't know what's going on, I want them to know what it means to follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. And not in just this, get saved, walk down the aisle kind of way. But I mean, it seems to me that following Jesus is walking down the alley or the hallway to the execution chamber. Yeah. And so I want my children to be, I want them to know Jesus loves me, but I also want them to know, Jesus loves those we kill. As well. So that's a big motivating factor. And I guess as far as scheduling, I kind of have different levels of involvement in things. Like if there's something I feel like I have to be involved with, my wife and I will work it out, and I will just go. If I'm scheduling a direct action, there's 2 things that I guess I try to take into thought, and that is one, if I can, to talk with my wife about our family life, but also, sometimes you don't get that opportunity. Sometimes things happen in an instant, and so there's that too. I guess the immediacy of it, and also, I think that the biggest advice or thing that I think is important is this idea of fearlessness. Huh. I mean, you really can't be a coward and do this kind of work in Texas. I mean, it wasn't a few weeks ago. I burned the Confederate flag in my backyard and put the picture all over the internet. And, people are saying they're going to kill me and blah, blah, blah. All of these kind of death threats and all this kind of stuff. And, a lot of my friends are like, aren't you scared? And I said, I'm not really scared because the people who are writing these comments are cowards. Because if they weren't cowards, they would just do something. They wouldn't sit at their computer and write all of this mess. So
they wouldn't just tell you.
I'm more worried about the people that are not writing than I am the people who are writing.
Mm-hmm. But so, that's what I was getting at about you functioning like a prophetic performance artist, right? Like you have a sensibility that you want to stir up something by using some means that people would see going this way and you turn it that way, right? Like you're going to burn a flag that people have been doing, but it's a Confederate flag, right? Or you're going to, if you're watching the video here, you're going to wear a tie, but it's going to be underneath your shirt, right? Like there's this thing you're doing, and I think you do it theologically. You do it in the book. You do it with thinking that we're not, when we execute people in this country, we're not doing the work of God. We are executing God. It's the execution of God. That's a thing you're doing, right?
I think that the piece that I'm really engaged with.
Was that in your house? Because that's in my head a lot. I'm just not sure.
Right, that was that was little Philip. But
way to go, Philip.
I think the piece that I'm engaged with is that these executions and these killings are not just executing God. Mm-hmm. They're executing. I mean, we're made in the image of God. They're executing us.
Just keep talking. I got to fix them. How about that, everybody? We both just walk away. For those watching the video feed, this is the video feed of me recording the podcast. You get the inside look. I was just saying I do this video feeds as the recording of the podcast, so that's why we get to do stuff like get up and walk over there, go help your kid, go plug in an iPad, that kind of thing.
But people are still watching on Facebook Live.
They sure are.
All right,
and they'll keep watching. People. Well, here's the point. Really, really smart people, really interesting, really engaged people are trying to find really interesting conversations all the time. And there's not that many. I mean, they're hard to find. So you don't have to be very good to keep people's attention on the internet.
Yeah.
So we're doing all right. So I was asking you about this thing of you finding this way of turning the story, right? Which I think you see to be in the tradition of Jesus. Like that's,
absolutely.
And that's one of the things I appreciate about you, the work you're doing. A lot of progressively minded people who could talk about queer theology, who could talk about the kinds of systemic abuses in our society. There's a whole genre of us, right, that some of us run around in. And many times in those situations and settings, people are unnerved by using their deep religious narratives and their deep religious storylines to frame what they're doing. And,
right.
And you're not one of those. Like you are doing that in the book, especially almost intentionally. Like I could feel it. I don't know if that's what you were trying to do, but that you were making sure the arguments you're making and the call that runs all the way through the book is rooted in a larger narrative of religion and faith to call us to a more beautiful way to be.
Sure. I mean, I think that the great failure of progressive Christianity is that in our conversations about social justice, there's not a spirituality that goes with it often. And then you find progressive folks who don't want to talk about their spirituality. They go to almost the monastic level sometimes,
yeah.
and get really into like the spiritual disciplines. And I think they do that so they don't really have to talk about, like faith. And I mean, I think it really unnerves people when I talk about getting saved.
Yeah.
I do that a lot because I think it's important. I think we need to get saved from killing. I think we need to get saved from capitalism and, all of these other pieces. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm
so let me ask you, I want to drill down on that. What makes you comfortable and confident that that imagery, those metaphors can carry? Some people might say, well, yeah, white guys, you get to use that sort of stuff because, it's, but I think you're more sensitive around those issues than just that. So what is it that gives you the confidence that you can dig into those phrases and not lose yourself or other people in the story the way a lot of people have felt lost in it?
I think a good analogy is, when you get your ass kicked a couple of times, sometimes you get used to getting your ass kicked.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems like, I've been down this road for, a number of years now, and I'm used to being corrected, called out, all of these types of things. And quite frankly, most of the time I don't give a shit.
Yeah.
And I think that's because I care when I see God in a space. And I very much, use this barometer of the least of these. I mean, it's very interesting when you have all of these upper middle class, people sitting in, mainline Protestant churches and saying, you shouldn't act this way.
Telling you not to act this way?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
And it's kind of like, and I probably shouldn't say too much because I want to sell, some books, but we have a huge United Methodist population here in North Texas.
Yeah.
Texas, some of the largest annual conferences in the United Methodist Church in the country. And I went to a Methodist seminary for a while, Emory, and, I've got a lot of Methodists that I love, and there are a lot of people who are exceptions to this rule. But, Methodists down here, like moderation is the greatest virtue of all.
Right, yeah.
Like conversation. Yeah. And people tell me all the time, Jeff, you're not facilitating conversation.
Yeah, you're just yelling at people. Right.
You're just yelling at people. Yeah. And my response is always, who gives a shit? I mean, because my goal is not to like fit your norms, because I am, and I think the prophets teach us this, I am very comfortable standing outside the gates by myself, screaming, yelling, throwing rocks, whatever I can do to demand repentance. Because what I'm able to see is that, lately I've been having this conversation about folks who are polyamorous. And it's very interesting to me how many people will call themselves progressive on every other issue. And then they get to this issue and they say, oh, wait a second, this is too much.
Yeah.
Love is love, but not here.
Yeah. No, I get, I have felt that very pressure myself.
And so I guess I bring that up just to say that, these families, these relationships, I mean, we say, well, I mean, PFLAG says this all the time. If we can just have conversation, things will change. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You see a lot of the LGBT, I guess, nonprofit world talking about conversation and those types of things. but it seems to me that sometimes you just have to demand to be seen.
Yeah,
you have to demand to be heard.
Yeah,
and I think that this conversation about polyamory that's kind of bubbling under the surface.
Oh, it's raging under the surface. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's coming. I mean, there's no getting around it. And the more these folks, come out of their homes, and we're able to see that, three people can be in a relationship and have children, and it'd be a beautiful thing. I don't think it's going to be too long before, especially a lot of the progressives who want to be progressive theologians who think they have to progressive theologize out everybody else. I think there'll be a lot more scholarship around Solomon and his many wives in the days to come. But
interesting. Well, I think what you're tapping into, around that issue and just the conversation set methodology, is that I think what you're saying, and I like this a lot, is we need to hear one another. And one of the mechanisms to hear one another is to use a conversation. And I'm a conversationalist, and I run a church conversation. Like that's a mechanism. That's a methodology for hearing each other. There's other ways you hear people, right? You just listen to the radio, or you listen to music, or you go to a concert, or you walk in the woods. Conversation and dialogue is not the only mechanism for hearing each other. And what I hear you saying is, because I don't find you to be an unreasonable person that doesn't want to take in input. I think you're saying there are some things that will only be heard if they're said in a way that overcomes the normality that has kept that conversation quiet for so long. Is that somewhere right what you're getting at?
Yeah, my goal, I guess my thinking is when you hear me talk, to me, if you call me an asshole, I think that is a beautiful success, because what that tells me is you're going to go home and lay in your bed and think about what that asshole said. Huh. And so I'm not interested. I mean, I think there's a lot of other, speakers, theologians that, are really good at going into church spaces and, having, I guess, good conversation, I guess getting a good check to have those conversations. For me, I think I look at it as a goal in my career to be kicked out of more churches than I am welcomed into.
Yeah. And you're wanting to do that both on content and style, right?
Well, I don't see how you separate the two. Like certainly I'm not Jesus, but when you look at the life and person of Jesus, I mean, content and style are intertwined.
Right.
And and obviously I follow Jesus. I mean, Jesus is the model. I guess what we know of Jesus.
Yeah, right. Well, I was going to ask you about that in your. How old are you, by the way? It probably says
33.
Somewhere. 33. So if the 33-year-old Jeff, or if the 23-year-old Jeff was watching this conversation with the 33-year-old Jeff, what would that 23-year-old version think? And the 33-year-old version of Jeff, how do you think about the 23-year-old version of Jeff?
Doug, when I was 23, I was an MDiv student at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Perfect.
In Louisville. And
wow.
Studying under Dr. Moeller and
that's full-on Southern Baptist. Man, you were in the...
I mean, I was Southern Baptist. I mean, I'm ordained Southern Baptist. I was Southern Baptist for a very long time. On some days, still would call myself a Southern Baptist minister. Mm-hmm. But that would take a whole nother podcast. But, I think at 23, I was looking for a way to be different, a way to pursue Jesus differently than what I had become accustomed to, what I had known. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't know what that looked like. I mean, Doug, I'm sure you've experienced this place in your life, but in those moments, I didn't know there was anywhere else to go.
Yeah.
I didn't know there were other forms of Christianity. I thought
Totally.
the evangelical, maybe even the fundamentalist world was it. And so I think at 33 to 23, I would say, keep going. It gets better. I love that phrasing. Yeah. But and I think, better. In all honesty and truthfulness, I think there are a lot of young evangelicals who are in a similar space and need to hear that it gets better. Because at Southern, we were basically told, if you leave, you're going to hell. Like and it sounded like if you leave this physical space, you're going to hell. But nevertheless, this is a quick aside, but in that space, Russell Moore taught us about poverty. And that was the first time I had ever had any thought that poverty was connected to the gospel. I thought all Jesus was doing was giving a couple of quarters at the red light. Yeah. I didn't realize there was systemic poverty and these types of things. So I think that God used some of those people there to I guess, open my eyes slightly and push me to a place where my eyes could be open more. So again, I would say it gets better. 23 to 33, I think I would say, what the hell happened to you? Yeah. Because, I did my undergrad at Auburn University in Alabama. Sure. I very much, I was in a fraternity, and I very much ran with a wealthier crowd.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Did you grow up with money? Did you grow up in a family that upper middle class, upper class?
So my grandfather is a self-made millionaire, and really amazing guy. Huh. Ran away from home at 14 and developed a carbonation business that ultimately went into partnership with Coke. And so, yes, we had money, but not in the same way that this eighth generation descendant of Jefferson Davis had money.
Right. It wasn't. You knew people that were more rich than you.
Definitely, much more.
That's a real sign of money when you're not as rich as the people you know. then you got money.
That's right.
When you're poor and you realized I'm the richest of all my friends, that's when you know you're
right.
It works the other way.
So during those days, I very much wanted to be the prominent doctor, the prominent lawyer. Mm-hmm. I had it in my mind that I could follow Jesus and change the world by, making a lot of money. Yeah. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who do that. It's
really, really hard. Yeah.
But
that's a narrow path right there.
But I am saying that there was certainly a moment in those days where I realized that I was never going to be wealthy in the way that all these people were wealthy. And I also realized that, a lot of these girls I was dating were never going to be willing to make the sacrifices that would be necessary in order to, I guess, follow Jesus. I mean, when you're interested in going to here I am picking on the Episcopals, but if you're all about just going to the Episcopal church down the street and taking communion every week, it's kind of okay, well, how do we talk about what needs to come next? It blows my mind that obviously, and I love these folks. Some of the most progressive priests out there. Yeah. Some of the most conservative people can sit up under them and go home and not get anything, not do anything based on what they've heard. But nevertheless, I do think that my life began to change. And I've mentioned this on many occasions, but I think the LGBT community had a profound effect on me. with this idea that you don't have to be what everybody wants you to be.
Yeah, nice.
And I think that I passed through that space to a space of queer theology where I believe that doesn't just apply to LGBT folks; it applies to the world.
Yeah,
the image of God,
right? The non-conforming to the patterns of the world question, right? I mean, that whole thing that some of us were taught, that kind of phrase.
Do not conform to the patterns of the assholes.
By the way, you're an asshole. That's my compliment to you today. That's my compliment.
That's right.
So your PhD, tell us a little bit about that.
So it's actually a D-Min. I always feel like I have to correct that because, PhDs are quite snobby and they want to make sure that everybody knows.
Because somebody would have said.
Somebody will jump on Facebook and get me if I don't say that. But nevertheless, so I did, I'll go through the whole thing quickly. I did my undergrad at Auburn, and then I did an MDiv at Southern Seminary in Louisville. And then I went to Emory and did a THM at Emory. I studied with Brooks Holyfield, I feel like one of the greatest living American church historians. My project there was on Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1961 visit to Southern Seminary. And unbelievable scene, unbelievable moment. Right. King is up there, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, white seminarians, and they had one Black seminarian in the entire audience, and that's Emmanuel McCall, who is a pastor in Atlanta right now, probably in his 60s, late 60s, early 70s, but nevertheless, so that story is such a beautiful story because King really goes into this kind of war zone and just says, it's your job to change the world. Christians, it's your job to change the world. So after that, I went to the University of Alabama and did an MA in U.S. history. And there my project was on white ministers during the Civil Rights Movement. And so I was very interested in, from that space, what did it look like to risk your life when you don't have to? And so I had a lot of really interesting conversations, and a plug for the United Methodists. A lot of the Methodists a lot of the ministers who pushed out and really did the right thing throughout the South were young United Methodist ministers because of Wesley's emphasis on the social component.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Nevertheless, so from there, I did a Master's of Science in Healthcare Ethics, Bioethics at Creighton University in Nebraska. And then I got to Texas Christian Bright Divinity School, and I did my doctorate of ministry there. And that doctorate of ministry is focused. The Courage to be Queer is my
So you did 4 versions of master's degrees?
1, 2, yes, 4.
What? And then a terminal degree. What's wrong with you?
Well, I was interested, and I.
Okay, so here's what I find curious. Now I'm just going to be your therapist for a minute.
Sure.
You have this very strong, independent, nonconformity streak that's banded by this. You're choosing to be inside of systems that are all about conformity and power distribution. Like master's degrees in the United States are distributed to people who follow the rules, do the right thing so that they can achieve a higher level of reward in their chosen profession. Right. You're not in that. I mean, maybe the last one, you're kind of in the D-Min profession, I guess. But that's what's going on with the sort of two sides of your life or brain or spirit that are doing the full nonconformity. I don't care if you think I'm an asshole guy, and the guy that's like, I'm going to make sure I get my papers turned in on time and be sure that they're written in the structure, and that you're moving from one to the other over 13 years nonstop.
You know, I think if I had to do it all over again, like
you'd get a fifth master's degree.
If I started, like if I was starting my graduate education now, there's absolutely no way.
Really?
I would do it. You know, I think that, you know, our society, I mean, with all the education I have, it has taken that for me to realize that it's not necessary.
I see. I see. Yeah, sure.
It's not needed. And I mean, we live in a society that just pummels people with student debt.
Yeah.
And, you know, and Doug, forever, you know, I'm part of a millennial generation that was told, you know, if you get the degree, you'll get the job.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'm getting at. Like,
if you, you know, if you do what you love, you'll love what you do, you know, all of that bullshit. And it's just not true.
No.
And so I decided that me and my wife, Emily, decided that we're going to follow our hearts. And you don't get paid to do 200 mile walk in Texas. And you sure as hell don't get paid to burn Confederate flags. But
or to do podcasts.
That's right. I understand. That's right.
And to write books.
But yeah, most people, you know, it's funny, Doug. People think when you write a book and you get a book published, that you're going to make all kinds of money off of that.
Yeah, no, for sure. They have no reason to not think that's true.
Yeah, and like it's the same thing with these degrees. Like, oh my gosh, you have a doctorate. I bet you're just killing it.
Yeah.
And my wife is about to finish her doctorate.
Of course she is.
And,
I guess they're unbelievable.
Oh, she is definitely, Emily is definitely more, like when I want to confront someone from, you know, who hit one of our kids at a restaurant, she wants
hold on a minute. Like that's a thing that regularly happens. Like
you have
a protocol for a time when strangers hit your children?
Well, balance. Well, so two things.
It's Texas. It's just unbelievable.
One is, you know, this Texas way of being is like, you know, just bumping into shit the whole, you know, as you move. So there's that. But the other thing is, you know, often I get recognized in public, especially in the Metroplex. And we've had people be really nasty to our kids before.
Unbelievable.
And I'm the one that's like, you know, my nonviolent ethos turns violent quite quickly.
like you become a wannabe pacifist and nonviolent protester.
That's right. And Emily is, you know, Emily will say things like, "We just need to pray for them," and it's like, "Fuck that! I'm gonna take their head off." But you know, I that's another, I guess, interesting piece that I think about. I'm a very violent person.
Yeah. Almost all. I'm a pacifist too. You know, I don't kill bugs and stuff. I let other people kill my animals for me. But it's the same thing. It's because if not, like I'm an on and off switch on that stuff. Right. I don't have a dimmer. I'm either violent or not.
Right. I mean, when people talk about language, they say, "Well, Jeff, your language is really violent," and I'm saying, "Well, I'm sorry. Like, if I hurt your feelings, probably don't need to read any of my books again."
Well, I don't find this particular book. If people do have that feeling, I don't find this book to have that.
Yeah,
that tone to it.
This one is not certainly not. Well, maybe someone who's working on the execution team might find this book to be violent. But
yeah, I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know. That could be.
Our victims are victims of murder victims' families. I could see them saying that this is a violent book and offensive.
Yeah, maybe. I guess I don't know. It just doesn't have that. I've read books that feel like they're an assault.
War.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair deal. This one is. It has it has a whisper sense to it, like it's and maybe it's because of the way you've written it, maybe it's because of the way it has that arts kind of feel, because it's not following a typical written book logic sequence. I'm writing one now, and that sequence is boring to to authors, but it's part of the deal. This doesn't have that promise execution of the promise. Pardon the pun.
Yeah, it's very much kind of a stream of consciousness type,
yes.
type piece. And I write like that a lot. I'll tell you who I just love and admire as kind of a writing influence. But I love Shel Silverstein. Because those
Shel Silverstein on The Execution of God.
That's right. Those little ditties that he puts together are really amazing in that there's such profound truth for every age. This whole idea of where the sidewalk ends.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, my gosh, that's about as existential as it gets.
Well, that's why parents buy those books, right? That's always a trick. Pictures for kids, words for parents. If you want to write a good kids book.
That's right. And, I think the great liberation theologians are poets for the marginalized and the oppressed. Ernesto Cardenal and Gustavo Gutierrez and many others. Even Will Campbell, the great Southern Baptist writer.
Interesting,
he was someone who was able to kind of weave these stories together. And, like in Brother to a Dragonfly, I mean, he's able to bring out like what it looks like to be poor and, and seeking something meaningful within that. And, so I guess what I'm saying is that to me, poetry is, is the language of God. I don't think, we are interested when God speaks. I mean, that's why everybody hates Paul, right? But except 1 Corinthians 13, everybody loves that.
Yeah.
But, Jesus's words are poetic. They're not.
Sure. Yeah.
Meaning can be extrapolated in a lot of different ways. Like even when Jesus busts in the temple, and starts screaming at all these folks, you can just see the people there after they run out. Was he talking about me?
Yeah.
Oh, was he talking about me? Was he talking about you or that type of thing? So meaning becomes blurred. And what I love about that in terms of my writing is I want people to see, the book in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I want it to meet them. I want it to meet them where they are. And, when I work with publishers and editors, that's what they always get pissed off at me for. And they'll say things like, this needs to be clear. And I'll say, I don't want it to be clear. I have no interest in it being clear. And the reason for that is I think in clarity, we are lost. And I feel like in the darkness we are found.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the notes I would have about the book for people who are wondering about reading it. You really don't. I hope people care about the death penalty. I hope they care a lot about our nation not executing its own citizens on a variety of grounds and circumstances and situations, not the least of which is one tomorrow in Ohio.
Right.
So it's a very present problem that we do some executions in some ways through a long court system, and other times police on the street. Other times we abandon people or we allow poisoning of children in water systems. Like there's a lot of disposable human life that our country uses in our own country and around the world. I hope people care about that. I don't think someone has to already care about those issues to appreciate what you're doing in this book, though. I think it is clearly rooted in the death penalty, and I don't think you're going to finish the book without thinking differently about the process of killing and executing. But the reason I like that little preface bit is because it really does capture what you're trying to do with the book, even though it's got a dark cover and a dark topic.
Right.
It's calling to this to this other thing. So can I just read the last paragraph or the last installment of the book out loud for people in case they don't read it? At least they get the beginning and last, and they can say, "I think I know that book." You have this set of italicized runnings through the book. So it says, "Time was no more. Behold, I saw God die. I wept." I mean, it's very Book of Revelation, right? I mean, if you were doing that, but time was no more. Behold, I saw God die. I wept. I didn't know what to do. After they placed the sheet over the body, I turned away. I just wanted to get out of there. Not long after I turned back, I saw the sheet start to rise. God was alive. Death was no more. In a fit of rage, God destroyed the gurney. The damn thing exploded into 1,000,000 pieces. I heard God say loudly, "It is finished." It's a great ending to this book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so I think that's what you're doing in the book. I mean, I think it's really well laid out. I think there was a sense in which, there's a stream of consciousness and it's running and it's art and it's kind of memoir but there's this thing at the beginning and there's this thing at the end and, the pieces in between, you can go on that ride.
I also, I guess an important thing that goes along with what you're saying is when you talk about the execution of God, you're talking about, on one hand, God being killed, God going through this execution of process. But on the other hand, there's also this, double meaning in that. How do you execute God? Yes. How do you live God out? How do you think about God?
Right.
So there's a killing of God, but also a resurrection in the same title. And I think that's what this book is about. I mean, it's about the death penalty, sure, but it's also a theology of life.
Yeah.
How does death lead to life?
Yeah, when you ask those questions in the book, this fundamentally questions about the death penalty root us in questions about humanity, questions about one another, and questions about God.
Right.
And that's been going on, all the traditions, the religious and secular traditions, they're asking those questions. How do we live with ourselves? How do we live with one another? What is it that we consider and think of God? That is...
right.
I mean, that's what people are doing. So if you're into that, the book is called The Execution of God. People call it by a lot of other names like Executing God. The Execution of God, Encountering the Death Penalty, Jeff Hood.
All right.
Author extraordinaire.
Thank you, Doug.
Hey, thanks, buddy. Thanks, everybody on Facebook Live, too. And
thank you.
All right, so there you go. Hope you loved it. Hope you listened all the way through. Thanks for giving it over an hour. And if you did this on a workout, good for you, working out for a full hour plus. Thanks for being part of the podcast, everybody. Hope to talk with you soon. Bye.